Well, you'll see that Karen managed to stand in the line of fire quite well here. And I'd now like to introduce Harawira, who's one of our senior Māori PhD students in the School of Psychology at Victoria University. She's taken quite the difficult task of presenting for Anne Wapu, who, as I mentioned, has an illness and can't present. So here, I hope you'll focus your comments more towards a general interpretation. We're now moving more into the theory as we're holding on to, as opposed to details, because with the details of the coding, Arama will not be as au fait with these as, say, Karen was with her data. So please join me in welcoming Harawira.
I'm very happy to be here to present today. It's such a juicy topic, so I'm sure I'm going to enjoy this. Let me just cue myself up. So this research, the main question that I'll be addressing is how do New Zealanders, and I say New Zealanders, but I'll mention that these people are New Zealanders, but actually we don't know if they're New Zealand some of the time. But sorry, how is racism constructed in New Zealand's social media is what I'll be looking at. And this is based on research done by my very good friend and colleague Anne Wapu of Ngāti Kahungunu, and myself, Marata. I'm from Thematic in Ngāti Maniapoto. And I'll just say that if you agree with the research and you like it, then that must have been my idea. And if you didn't like it, then it's probably Anne's fault. Just leave it at that. So just to give you an overview of what I'll be doing is, firstly, I'll be presenting some material which will show you the content of Hone Harawira's email, which sparked a little bit of controversy, and what we'll be analysing is the comments that were made in response to those emails. So once I've done that, I'll present the method that we used. Very briefly, I'll present a content analysis of what those comments included. Then I'll move into a thematic analysis very briefly again, and what I'll be focusing mostly on is a theoretical analysis. So moving on from what Karen has done and presenting that. And as I do that, I'll be drawing in a little bit of Karen's work as well. So when I give examples with a theoretical analysis, I'll also draw in some of the comments that were made in response to Paul Kimber's comments. So this was here's an article from Te Karere, which explains Hone's controversial email.
Kei te haere mai te tai āhua mō Hone Harawira. Haina anō tana o mātu I te tai haere a whārema tai tā wāhi, e whakaraurua nei I tana kaha ki te whiukupu, kei te whakapitatu tātai nai me ki tā mātai tari I te whanganui ātara. I te kōrero ki tā mātai mātai ki tō rangopu a tino wikla. Tina.
Ai mohi ana tātou ki te momo o Hone Harawira he tangata tere ki te riri, tere ki te whiu kōrero. O tira he me mapare mata tonu ia, he māngai mo tōna iwi, tērā ētahi kupu e kore hoki e taria e ia te whiu. Kei kai taia Hone Harawira I te rānei, o tira I taine he rā kāre ana kukuri pene tā, mo tāna whakarere I ana hoa pāremata, kia haere ke ki pari me tōna hoa rangatira a Hilda.
Mōku rā, we nāu tui te wā I reira hau.
O tira kei te kirikawa tēnei kai taunaki I te Pāti Māori, nō reira I tuhi imera ia ki te mema mo te taitoke rau.
So I just asked in a half-joking fashion, well, who paid for Hilderly? And that's when he came back with a really abusive email response saying he doesn't give a...
Anei te whakautu, a Harawira.
Do you believe that white men bull too, do you? White mother have been raping our lands and ripping us off for centuries. If I get the chance to take her with me as part of my role as an MP, I will. I don't give a what you or anyone else thinks.
Hei whakakapinga.
If you want to take this to the press, go right ahead. Getting a response, an aggressive response, I'm not surprised. It's just the language that he used which surprised me.
Ko tā mai te kōrero kia I te tino he o taku kupu I taku he mera mo reira e hea ana le tikana kaua kōrero. Engari I tona nau ki te whakaro roto o kaua kōrero.
E hara Hone Harawira I te tangata mataku ki te kōrero I ona whakaro mo te Pākehā.
Harau I te pākehā. Harau I te mema e kōrero ni ngā kōrero o ngā pākehā.
O tira he āhua kei te haere, o tana whakamahi ngā kupu, white mother.
Hone Harawira has made a statement that's deeply offensive to a lot of New Zealanders.
I puta ngā whakahea tare ana turia mo Hone Harawira I runga I te reo irirangi, Engari kāre anō rāo kia kōrero a kamuhi. Ai tino māro ngā whakahea tari ana turia I te haerenga hone Harawira ki pari, nā reira ko te pātai nai ka pēhea, tēnā ho ngā tahi a te rōpu tō rangapu Māori I raro I tēnei kapua e tine.
Ka tira tēnā koe tēnā kāre kore he nui atu nā kōrero mō tēnei take.
I'll just pick up on Paul's comment before that. John Key didn't seem to be condemning Paul Henry, but he condemned Tony Harawira for what he said, and perhaps we should be grateful for that. Right, so just to go through quickly what the method we used was. First we did a Google search of Tony Harawira racist, and the results came up with lots of blogs and newspapers and online articles and YouTube clips. From these hits, we selected media items that both focused on Hune's email and had multiple comments from the public that we could analyse. And this resulted in the selection of 3 media items, 2 of which were YouTube clips, and a Te Karere one was one of those, and also a TVNZ article. And you've just seen one of the clips, and so I won't talk about that. The other YouTube clip was a 60 Minutes profile, and the third item was a TVNZ article. So we analysed the comment threads, we read through them to get a feel for the data and potential themes arose, and then we used in vivo software to code all of the responses. I won't go into that in any further detail, but here's a content analysis of what the types of responses were. Similar to Karen's presentation, a lot of it was off topic, so 21.9% of the postings were off topic. Many of them used obscenities, anti-Māori slurs, anti-Pākehā slurs, deleted comments. Then we have something that's actually on topic in this case, which was social historical references, other discursive techniques that we used, aggressive threats, and another discursive technique there, social comparison. But if we look at all of those responses, 73.3% of those were off topic and offensive. So most of what we're getting in this type of media is not actually responding to the issue, which is Tony Harawira's email, but rather abusing each other or other groups in this media. And this is a look at how it is that we get so many off-topic responses, and that is that while the first comment might respond to the clip, what then happens is that people just start fighting amongst themselves in their comments. So first of all, people might offer justifications for why they agree or disagree with what was said. It very quickly moves into judgments, accusations, personal attacks, insults and obscenities, off topic, and then if the comments that are made are too offensive, then they're just deleted. So what I'll do now is I'll just read through an example of how that discourse moves, sometimes from being on topic into very, very off topic. And then what I'll do is I'll read through quite a large chunk of what was presented on these social media forums, just to give you a feel for how that works, and then I'll refer back to some of these comments as I move through the presentation. So this is just one example here. Now the underlined parts of text here, these are the people's usernames. So this first comment's at examination board, so the comment is directed at another user whose name is examination board. So at examination board, you're too dumb to realise that Māori have mastered your customs to the point that governments have changed legislation to stop them from progressing. The argument here is that Tony Harawira sends a racist email and the country has a problem with it, but Don Brash campaigns over the whole country talking the same trash as you, but that's okay. Māori are going to be rich because the governments will compensate them. Examination board, you're not sophisticated enough to get anything by you being pulled. To which examination board replies, the fact that a small portion of New Zealand a small portion of Māori are fighting for their pathetic race and the rest are either in prison, lazing around at home, bludging off the taxpayer, or working at their P-lab pretty much means Māori are destined for failure. Māori aren't as evolved as the white man. Even if they succeed, they wouldn't know what to do with so much power because they only know what to do when the white man tells them. By examination board. Lovely, isn't it? And another user comes in at this point, whose name is You Eat Turds Now. And he says to examination board, "You only know what to do when I tell you. You're an expletive. Go back to sucking the sheep's expletive. Now, by the way, everyone knows you're an expletive. You are the expletive of YouTube. Bah ha 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 ha." Following comment was too offensive, so it was removed. And then Brad Fish replies to You Eat Turds Now with, "If you're dumb, why bother about the whole sheep shagging thing, you brain-dead caveman?" So as you can see, things spiral into personal attacks and racial attacks very, very quickly in these sites. So what Anne had the pleasant task of doing was to go through all of these things and make codes up for each little section of talk. These are the initial codes that she generated. Obviously, I'm not going to go through all of these. But what we did was we arranged these things into major overarching themes. So the first one that I'll discuss is position. So this is whether you were pro-Hone, anti-Hone, or sitting on the fence. The second was a justification. So the justifications, these types of discourses have been studied a lot in the literature. So a lot of the common ones that we've seen before have come up here. So calls for people to move on, stop thinking about the past. People need to harden up, as Karen mentioned, that there should be freedom of speech and Hone should be able to say what he wants to, that there's a double standard, that Hone can get away with it, but a Pākehā person couldn't, etc. So this was the justification that people used, and I've put the little arrow there towards position to show that that the justification was used to support their position. Now I'll move to the discursive techniques that we used in order to make the case. So they were able to provide the justification by using particular discursive techniques such as historical references, accusations, making social comparisons, similar to what Karen found in her literature. And we saw an example of that where the first comment that I read out, the person compared what the case would be like Don Brash says, this kind of thing, and it's okay, well, what Harawira is saying is, so it's the use of the comparison. Self-deprecation, reflexively and emotional discursive techniques, in-group, out-group comparisons, sarcasm and the redirection of blame, and then, as I mentioned, off-topic responses. And I'm not sure if you can see, but there's a small arrow that's linking justification to the off-topic response. So they might have had an off-topic argument that they were making, and they used the justifications we've seen before to support that argument, that unrelated argument, and that these off-topic responses may link into their position as well, or may not. They might just be completely quite random and may not even make a reference to the original email itself. And there's some examples of what those emotional off-topic responses might have looked like. Okay, so that's the first few analyses, just to give you a feel for what was in those comments. But what I'm going to focus on now is just the justification section. So with the section on the justifications that were used for why people supported or didn't support Harawira's emails, or rather why they thought his language was okay or not okay, I'll be doing a theoretical analysis of that. Now, what I found through the theoretical analysis of that, there were three main dimensions that people used to assess whether or not talk was racist. And these three dimensions were offensiveness, oppressiveness, and accountability. So in terms of offensiveness, people tended to show that if they considered something to be highly offensive, then that was not okay. So things like offensive language, offensive labels, and negative stereotyping, those were things deemed to be not okay. And examples of people's talk, if they thought that something wasn't offensive, they'd say, "Oh, you're being too sensitive, it's just a joke." Whereas if they thought something was highly offensive, then they would label it blatant racism. And just a note note about offensiveness. As I mentioned, I'm using these dimensions to describe how people who have made comments are positioning the emails as being racist or not racist. But offensiveness is highly subjective, so it's, and I'm using the example here of the Māori number plate example that you may or may not be familiar with. I'm not getting many nods, so I'll talk through it a little bit. What happened was a gentleman on Trade Me put up a number plate that just read Māori, and completely to his shock and horror, hundreds of racist, in fact thousands of racist emails were put onto his Trade Me account in terms of questions to the vendor. The first comment was, "Don't you know how offensive it is to Europeans to sell that for $99,000? So someone is finding that very, very offensive. So this is a highly subjective thing. So in this case, simply being pro-Māori was deemed by someone as being highly offensive. Okay, so the next dimension of racism is oppressiveness, and this has a structural component and a functional component. And I had a little treat earlier of seeing the young lady at the back present her talk on structural discrimination earlier. So this is an analysis of existing power structure, and also an analysis of the function of talk that these people who were making comments were using in order to position comments as racist or not racist. So in terms of analysing power structures, which group in the context of the argument is in the position of power and which group is in a position of subordination. And in terms of the function of talk, it's looking at how does the talk function to maintain existing unequal power relations or to denounce that inequality. And although some might see, well, I think most people would see Hone's comments as being highly offensive, some people use the justification that it was countering oppressive power relations as a justification for it being okay. For example, comments such as Hone's just getting one back for Māori. Even though there is if we look at power relations in New Zealand, it's very easy to say that Pākehā are in a position of power and Māori are not in a position of power. However, the argument is also, this dimension is also used by majority groups to claim that comments are racist by claiming that they are being oppressive. For example, with the double standard that Māori are allowed to get away with saying comments like this. So even though structures are not really a subjective thing, there are clear power relations in the country, the discourse is used on both sides to make particular arguments. Now, these two dimensions, oppressiveness and offensiveness, are related, so I think in actual fact they probably cross each other a little bit like that. So if something's highly oppressive, it's likely to be offensive as well. But if we just imagine we've rotated those dimensions now and present them in this way here, we can see that we can use these two dimensions to position talk in different ways. So talk that is not offensive and is not oppressive, we can call that acceptable discourse. If talk is highly offensive and highly oppressive, well, that's overt racism, often termed old-fashioned racism, and it's discriminating. If talk is highly oppressive but is low on offensiveness, then this is more of an insidious type of racism, often called modern racism or symbolic racism. And I've labelled both of those two high oppressiveness quadrants as discrimination because they're supporting those structural systems of oppression. If talk is highly offensive but low on oppressiveness, then this is inverse racism, still prejudice, but it's not, the function of that talk is not to maintain unequal power relationships in the country. Okay, so these kind of quadrants were used by the people making comments to position the comments as being racist or not racist. But then what people would do after that was say, okay, well, what should be the outcome? Should Hone Harawira be reprimanded for what he said or not? And they use the accountability dimension to talk about whether or not he needed to be reprimanded. So if it was deemed that he had high accountability for what he had said, then people tended to think that he needed to be reprimanded. So they talked about him being accountable as he's taxpayer funded, that there should be particular standards for elected officials. And this was also prevalent in Paul Henry, the comments made about him, and that he represents New Zealand. He's seen as a figure that represents New Zealand. He's giving us a bad image overseas, saying that he has high accountability. People who said that Harawira or Paul Henry had low accountability tended to think that he didn't need to be, or that they didn't need to be reprimanded. And one of the justifications for Hune's comments was that it was a private email, so he shouldn't be reprimanded. Paul Henry gets the comment, he's just saying what we're all thinking as a way to remove the accountability from him. Harawira, people say he's just representing his electorate, and he says it himself as a way of saying I'm not accountable for this racist talk. And Paul Henry also, the argument was also made that TVNZ put him up to it. And maybe I just forgot to mention on this slide that, and I think this is a point that some people may choose to disagree with, but this slide really shows that there's a qualitative difference between different types of race-based talk. So the use of the parallels that people make, those social comparisons, if so-and-so said this, they'd get away with it, it would be fine. So when you make that social comparison, you're talking about groups in a different power relationship, a different position in that power relationship. And that's why people use that so much, because it's effective. However, that ignores the power relationship between those two groups. So for example, when Paul Henry thinks it's hilarious to laugh at somebody's name, and when people say it's okay for him to do that, they often don't consider that this is a society that's very intolerant. A lot of societies are very intolerant towards minority cultures and minority languages, and that just by laughing at someone's name in the way that he did, what he's really doing is he's maintaining his privileged position as someone who's from a dominant culture and speaks a dominant language in the country. And I think that's why, comedians or even myself as belonging to a minority group, some people say it's okay for us to, laugh at each other or to jest. And that might be because of the power relationship between, myself and other minority group members. But, in saying that, you still need to be mindful that, as Māori, that we have certain privileges in the country that other minority groups don't have. So we need to all be mindful of the power relationship we have with other people. Okay, and just to make some summary comments. We've seen that social media reveals the ugly side of freedom of speech. People have a cloak of confidence, or what I call a cloak of cowardice, that is a catalyst for discourse that most people wouldn't dare in public forums, reserving such discourse for closer, safe circles of like-minded individuals. We've seen that online conversations deteriorate quickly into kindergarten one-upmanship. So there's a loss, or people are ignoring the original argument for the sake of getting a one-up on a weak point made in a previous statement. Turns into a public sparring match with no resolution, as opposed to being a forum for meaningful dialogue. And it leads to downward spiralling discourse that concludes with obscenities, threats and deleted comments. On the other side, revealing this ugly side in a way is good because it provides evidence for this type of discourse that some might say that doesn't happen in New Zealand. We can see that it does happen. And it allows us to deal with some of the underlying issues. And it allows us to create strategies for dissuading race-based attacks and to encourage dialogue. I think that the mass media and social media are responsible for fanning the flames of racial hatred. Because why wouldn't they? Controversy increases the hits you'll get on your website. So many times I'll be, on my Facebook. I'm studying most of the time, Jim, sorry, but occasionally I'll have a Facebook break, and some of my Māori friends will have put a status update saying, oh, log on to this site, it's disgusting, make a comment. And what do? We all log on and their hits go through the roof, which is why Paul Henry's been hired somewhere else. So yeah, we can see that they are motivated to have this type of content because we are appalled and offended and outraged, and so we visit these sites. In terms of consequences for this type of discourses, when no consequences exist, when there is that cloak of cowardice, we see that people make offensive comments in sites further racism. But on a much more positive note, we can see that when consequences do exist, like a gentleman mentioned here, that when you have an accountability, when you're not under that cloak of cowardice or that cloak of anonymity, where consequences exist, people are very quick to quash it. So, with the example of the Māori number plate, what happened was the people who wrote horribly offensive, racist comments were very quickly blacklisted by other TradeMe users, and anyone who's a TradeMe addict like me will know that feedback on TradeMe is really, really important. You value their little star ratings and all that. So when these people started getting blacklisted, the comments just dwindled down. So that racist talk was squashed very, very quickly. Perhaps not quickly enough, but it did happen. So some recommendations out of this is that website hosts could be like if you're wanting to be a responsible website host, you might want to filter what is posted, maybe focusing on topic conversation instead of letting this discourse spiral into racial hatred. There might also be a need for education around the use of social media. So threaded behaviour comments and protocols that could be learned. We could educate people on how to respond without entering into futile debates. So it's, if you're a minority group, you're probably used to being outraged. It's about where do you want to spend your energy? Do you want to be in the basement arguing with unknown people, or do you want to try and do something positive about it? And what happened actually with Paul Henry is that Paul Henry said lots of different comments that Māori people found appalling. So at first, the first comments that I saw on my Facebook were, check it out, it's disgusting. And then it moved to, let's boycott breakfast, you know. So it's about those smart strategies that you can do to support or to discourage particular discourses. There could be more civic education in schools for online behaviour. I mean, it's how many young children are on YouTube, many, and as a parent, would you want your children to see some of these types of comments? So there might be a need for education around that. Being smart about your use of economic and political pressure that I just mentioned, and just to summarise again, the penthouse. This is not my language. I don't really like the penthouse basement analogy because it just sounds too much like a social hierarchy. But the penthouse sends signal to the basement about what is okay to let out, and we can't believe that it won't affect our living space in the middle. Yeah, so I might just leave it at that, but thank you very much for your attention. Okay.
Questions or comments now? Let's see, anybody who's not spoken would like to speak? Okay, well, good.
Max had mentioned about using your a lot of social media, especially, I mean, Facebook is about connecting with people that know you and connecting with as many people that know you as possible. So for something like this to happen on Facebook, it might be less because you are using your real name. And Google Plus is Google's brand new social media platform, and you have to use your real name. You know, you can sign up for anonymous accounts, but the whole thing is to use your real name and connect with other people. So, and YouTube is sort of anonymous. So I think that things like this might decrease. Would you agree with that in the future? Would you agree with that assessment?
If things will decrease as people tend to use their own names? I think so, yeah. And I think as social media becomes more common and a bigger part of our lives, we'll start to use a bit more discretion in terms of what sites we look at, what types of debate we engage with. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
I'd just like to actually call into question the methodology surrounding what you've researched here, but not the way you've researched it, but the way you've presented it. I think using the blanket term social media, when clearly your main source of data has been YouTube, I think to then go and grab a broad brush and I think all social media, which is everything from email to the big five, your LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Google Plus, that sort of thing. I think it's quite a big call to go and then start saying that social media is this and social media is that, when all you've done is taken things from, like, mostly, I'd say, YouTube. When, if you look at the demographic data of the users of YouTube, especially the commenters, they're especially young. So I think to really say that social media has caused this, I think that's quite damaging and is sort of really untrue. I mean, if you were to look at other social medias, I think you would have possibly found a similar arguments going on, similar points, but possibly a much more reasoned, passionate debate. So I think that saying that it's social media when actually it's YouTube is my point.
Yeah, well, thank you for your comment. I've used Facebook and I've seen some of the groups that exist on Facebook, and I think that it might be a naive statement to suggest that that's not happening on Facebook as well, because if you look for it, I promise you it's there.
Yeah, I'd have to say that's a bit of my fault. We've been kind of coming up with the kind of labels here, and I would agree that to some extent, to extend it too broadly, but it isn't just YouTube, so that the TV1 News one was actually, there was a high level of obscenity as well. But I agree, to come up with the right label is probably a bit of nuancing that we're going to need to do.
I had a number of two questions and a comment. The first question was just about, it's also about method, which is about the second order nature of this. One of the strange things is by following up on other events which took place in other media, you have in some way created a very particular view of the material. So some other event takes place on television or somewhere else, but then you're looking at the second order comments on it. The issue there is about how initiatory or whether it's just reactive. And the significance of that will come in my comment, I think, but it's a question of whether that skews the kind of data you got, and whether in fact there's all sorts of other initiatory statements. I mean, that you could find in different ones. That was the first thing. The second thing was just how worried should we be, which is a question you can't answer, which is about representation. And how representative is this of New Zealand society, how broad it is. And both of you have kind of felt in a kind of visceral way, I mean, this horde of very nasty people out there. But, I mean, how do we know that and how extensive is it? My comments were, of how we do the translation. Part of not reading the discourse was assuming that the discourse wasn't its own discourse. And this is why I'm a bit anxious also for a completely different reason about basements and penthouses. They may well be parallel discourses. But what we didn't get was a kind of way of reading the uniqueness of this discourse. To label it racist is immediately to evaluate it in terms of different frames of reference. And so partly it's how we're going to evaluate how significant it is that a lot of people, you spend more time in the pub, I mean a lot of people speak like this on a kind of daily basis. The language is used, but it doesn't have any kind of necessary behavioural referent. And it may not bespeak of the kind of emotional affective registers you're suggesting, but has become a kind of YouTube response speak that has its own parameters and needs a rather different form. What you're doing is saying, this is really bad penthouse talk, because the parameters and the modes of analysis you're using are assuming that you're going to frame it in terms of the laws of other discourse. When, I don't know, if you, whereas my suggestions, it might have its own parameters, its own framework, its own contours, its own resonances. And if you don't do that, this is more power to you for having done it. There's obviously, this is the beginning of a whole lot of work. But I suggest there may well be, like all discourse, a set of, a framework of this sort of discourse, which will then be much more interesting as you begin to see repetitions and refractions and parallels to some sort of evaluation. So otherwise I was a bit worried, because I agree with you that people in the penthouse don't speak like people in the basement, but it may just be at the level of discourse that the difference is significant.
Thank you.
One aspect that might be worth bearing in mind too is the history of the media. There is a tendency when any new medium arrives for it to push boundaries, to behave in unacceptable ways. Early radio was absolutely offensive to early America, to early 20th century society, particularly in America. Comics are another classic example, and there appears to be a socialization process which gradually, taking your last slide, modifies the behaviour of the mediums as they're captured either by the society or by capitalism or by whatever it is. So I think there is an element within the analysis that bears some sort of historical attachment as well.
Just to mention a little bit is, the thing that I find the most unique about these YouTube memes and to a certain extent the TV1 memes was the level of obscenity, the gratuitous obscenity. And apparently this is, in speaking to Paul's comment, this is relatively normative on this medium. And whether it's meaningless or meaningful or requires a new frame, you're absolutely right. We don't know exactly what it means. What we do know is that the people are reacting to them in the typical ways that you would react to them if someone said that to you, to your face. So it's not like they're engaging in this very humorous exchange. It is that people are coming on and just whacking each other, that if this had been face-to-face, there would have been violence. So that's what I'm saying. The only way we have is just reading the comments for what they're worth. Now, if the comments mean something completely different, some coded scheme, we can't really get at that with the kind of methodology that we're using. But the only thing we can do is to follow the sequence of postings, and the sequence of postings are not demonstrating an alternative logic. That this is really funny when I get called these expletives in there. Yeah.
Sorry, can I comment on it? My take on that response is quite different, because I would say they're probably saying it's because they're not talking to each other's faces. That degree of anonymity is what is a new development in the social medium. And it's that's giving the freedom to people to speak in a way that they wouldn't speak to each other, either directly or by named emails.
No, there's no disagreement about that. The question is there a different meaning or a different affect to the terms? When you call, I can't use the terms here because we're being recorded. They're really completely bleeped out. You get 2 pages of furious, racist, bleeped out talk, and the question is, does that mean something different? That's what Paul is asking. Does it mean something different? We're not disagreeing that it's spurred on by anonymity and this freedom to express. The question is, does it mean something different?
All of those words were used by Howard Stern on radio and television constantly through the 70s and 80s. Mainstream.
More.
Thank you for your presentation. I was looking at the recommendations, which aren't on the screen anymore, but I was just sitting and wondering, some of the recommendations were good, but it seems to me they don't quite go far enough, because if you had, I can't remember what they were now, but if you had, I think one was about responsible posting and filtering comments or providing education about online behavior. To me, it seems that it's not really getting at the root of the problem. That social media, yes, probably flames things because of the anonymity, we agree on that. But if it's coming from another place of racist behavior, filtering it or providing guidance about how we should behave online isn't going to change those fundamental ways of thinking. So I'm just wondering if that's part of your discussion in your research, or if that's sort of outside the realms of what you're looking at.
Well, absolutely. Thank you for that comment. I think I may have just touched on it when I said that one of the joys of this type of discourse that we see on some sites is that it actually makes it visible to a lot of people who might deny that it's there. And in terms of of how to stop people being racist. If I had some recommendations, I would have given them. But yeah, it's not an easy task. But I think the first step is really to label it, find out how to label it, and then deal with it. And I think too much focus in New Zealand has just been to move it from overt racism to what, these PC discourses that we get all the time, which doesn't do anything to challenge the actual structural inequalities. So sorry, that was not an adequate answer, but those are my thoughts at this time.
Kia ora, that was really, really interesting. I admire your willingness to look into the seedy underbelly of our society. I don't think I've got the stomach for it, but I facilitate an email network called the Aotearoa Ethnic Network, and it's been really interesting to watch that develop. But one of the potentials that I see for social media in the broader sense that your previous speaker, audience member was mentioning, is the potential for anti-racist work. And for me, how that has happened is two ways that can be brief. One is when the North and South article came out a few years back, the Asian Angst one. Z-Main sent this email on AEN, a whole bunch of us responded and spammed the New Zealand Press Council rather than writing a letter to the editor, and we did it in a timely way. And then when the Paul Henry thing happened again, first I heard of it was on Facebook, and then there was this opportunity to respond really quickly. So for me, I avoid the seedy underbelly, and I praise you for going there. And for me, the thing that I find most valuable about social media in all its forms is just the potential to respond in an easy, accessible, rapid way to some of the decision making.
Thanks, Ruth. We're coming close to a close. I'll take one or two more comments, but I guess the one thing I'd like to echo there is that we are in very early stages of this research, and I guess a lot of what we're talking about is actually agency. We're just trying to get a handle on what is the meaning of these kinds of things. And one of the agencies I guess I'd like to invite you to do is that we're filming, we'll post this, we'll post the PowerPoints, they'll be available on our website. There's a sheet of paper being passed around before, a small sheet of paper with red writing, I don't know where it's gotten to, it's over here. So we'll basically put this out and say, tell us where you think this needs to go. We're essentially in the initial phases of this, and it is that agency of taking control of certain spaces, of having the kind of positive spaces that Ruth is talking about, agreeing with your point that labeling this blanket in terms of social media, which actually happened in this front page article in the Waikato Times, is not necessarily the most productive way of doing things, and really to engage our communities in creating the kind of spaces we'd like to see in social media, while realizing it's not going to stop this massive pluralism. There is massive pluralism available, and the types of activities that we thought, which kind of, I guess, dismayed us in some ways, are there. They are, and we haven't seen them in this type of profundity before, and we don't know exactly how representative these are. There's no way to figure that out from this media. So maybe I'll just take two more comments, and then maybe we can continue on after tea. So the last couple of comments. Anybody who's not spoken before? Not spoken before.
I'm wondering if there's also some issues just about misperceiving written communications. I know there's a lot of blatant swearing going on here, but even just from how careful we've needed to be within a couple of school and a sports team with just moderating emails, the way that, and I think some of that's about people reacting so quickly that you can hit send so quickly, and this is non-anonymous forums, and I imagine anyone who's been involved where there's a group email, and I don't know if it's everyone, but as soon as people can reply all, you can suddenly have a flame war, even between people who know each other very well. So there's an immediacy that, and emails get sent late at night, and the immediacy that kind of takes a lot of people's own censoring out, even when there's names attached. So I'm wondering if that adds in.
Yeah, thank you for that. Definitely one thing to take into account. And did you?
Yes, I'd just like to support those comments that you were making about the fact that you've actually gone into the underbelly and had a look at it, which is pretty seedy, but there is all sorts of other opportunities. And one of your comments was around the fact that you said that the penthouse moderates what comes out. But I think that there are also comments that you made about the fact that the Prime Minister commented about Hone, but didn't comment about the previous comments. And there are other times when he has come out and commented, and it changes the discourse. It changes the way we think about things. It changes, but the discourse happens along the way quite usefully. And when Paul Henry started talking about what does a New Zealander look like, well, he didn't ask that question, but the next question was, what does a New Zealander look like? There was a whole lot of discussion that was actually really positive around that in this country about diversity, and that these things can actually spark things that are quite useful even when there is that rubbish going on. So, across the social media, I think there is some really good opportunities that happen, and we need to hold on to those, because it was that spark of people coming together and commenting that actually made the moves for Paul Henry to say, actually, he's got to go. And he stepped down because of that amount of comment that you could see the writing on the wall. So, hey, I think it's all good.
Any final comments?
I don't have a comment, but I just have a plea that there are evaluation forms in your hands. The Commission would really love to hear from you about the sessions and how you felt about them. Sorry, James. Thank you.
Well, so the forms here, those of you, and thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you very much, Arama, Anne, who's not here, and